and I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right. Damla and I are both in the food science department here at UT in Knoxville, and I just got back from 3 weeks in Australia, so I'm a little bit jet lagged. But I'm going to do the first half of the presentation, and then she will pick up at the last part. This talk is about the Food Freedom Act and the changes that have occurred over the years, and then how that applies to the folks that want to make homemade food items. And I forgot to tell you, so I'm a process engineer here in food science, extension specialist. We help entrepreneurs and businesses with food processing, mainly regulatory compliance, making sure products are safe, and do various testing here in the department, things like that. So the Food Freedom Act is one item that we've tried to educate people on because there are no legislative requirements basically under the Food Freedom Act. And so we're just trying to do some educational programming in that regard. So we'll jump into it. The little bit of history. So prior to 2007, Tennessee laws prohibited the sale of any foods that were produced without a permit or license. So homemade food items could not be sold prior to that time. In 2007 is when they began the quote unquote cottage food laws that most people refer to. And in this case, it allowed non-potentially hazardous foods, which were basically at that time baked goods, jams and jellies, and dry spice blends, things like that, things that were uh, not hazardous for pathogens in particular. They did require a license and inspection of domestic kitchens at that time, and uh, there was a training course required, and we have a domestic kitchen course that was required at that time. We'll talk. Maybe we'll have time later to talk about that. We're revising this course to meet the new regulations. But then in 2012, uh, the inspections of the home kitchens became optional. The Department of Ag realized that they couldn't inspect all these locations, didn't want to come into people's homes. And so if you were not inspected, then there was this signage required that said that the products were made at a private home and not licensed or inspected. And then in 2017, they stopped licensing and permitting home kitchens or domestic kitchens, and but the people could still make non-potentially hazardous items, jams and jellies, baked goods, etc. Uh, but the foods could be made in different locations. They didn't have to be made in your home. So the term homemade food item was not part of the rules yet. So it could be a home kitchen, it could have been a community kitchen, shared space like a church or a restaurant, even off hours. And then in 2022 is the first version of our Food Freedom Act here in Tennessee. And this Food Freedom Act is sort of moving across the country, different forms being adopted by different states. And we were one of the first, not the first, but one of the earlier adopters here in Tennessee. The first version passed by the legislators allowed homemade, or created a definition for homemade food items, and then it replaced the term non-potentially hazardous foods with non-TCS foods. And non-TCS means that the food item did not require time or temperature control for safety. So if you think about jams and jellies, baked goods, those are not things that are going to grow bacteria very quickly. They're either due to a lot of sugar in the jams and jellies and pretty dry baked goods. But the term was similar, but it also opened it up to canned food items like preserved pickles or chow chow or hot sauce, things like that. Things that were properly preserved are included in the non-TCS category that weren't part of non-potentially hazardous. Okay, so the producers in this case now must use their private residence. So it sent people that were using community kitchens or commercial kitchens without a permit had to go back to their home kitchen because of the definition of a homemade food item, which I'll share in the next couple slides. But homemade food items could not include or contain things like alcoholic beverages, meat, fish, eggs, dairy products, or other time temperature controlled for safety foods. And then in 2025, they made an addition to a revision again to our Food Freedom Act. This is our current version, and it was modified to now allow TCS foods. So it's still allowed non-TCS foods, those shelf-stable items, but also allowed some time and temperature controlled for safety food items with some limitations and restrictions that we'll see here in a minute. So this broadened the number of food items. So basically anything except items that are restricted, not allowed, can be made in your home kitchen and sold in the state of Tennessee. So these changes took effect July of last year, almost a year ago now. And what is the TFFA Act exactly? It's an exemption from the state's food manufacturing regulations for homemade food items produced and sold in the state of Tennessee. And so from the Tennessee Code, we see that it says the production and sale of homemade food items under this chapter are exempt from all licensing, permitting, inspecting, packaging, and labeling laws in this state, except when the Department of Health is investigating a reported foodborne illness. So that makes a lot of people think that they're exempt from all regulations, but in fact, there are some restrictions and limitations in the act itself. So there are some labeling and packaging and points of sale restrictions in the act. So we have to point those out. Okay, back to the definition of a homemade food item. It means any food item not including non-alcoholic beverages, which is produced and if packaged, is packaged at the private residence of the producer. So produced and packaged at the private residence of the producer. So this requires the homemade food items to be made at the producer's private residence. There's no other locations allowed. The word at, I think, is important here because I think this allows things like maple syrup to be made in a facility on your private residence or at your private residence, but not necessarily in your home kitchen. And so you can see how that applies. It doesn't say in a private residence, it says at. So I think that's important. All right, what homemade food items can be sold under the TFFA? Well, the new version, according to the Act, says that these TCS foods, these time and temperature controlled for safety foods, cannot include unpasteurized milk or foods that are or contain alcoholic beverages, fish, shellfish, meat, meat byproducts, or meat food products. And even though it's lost in the new version when they made these revisions, the non-TCS food items must also meet these same criteria. We've talked to the legislators who created the bill, and seems to be the case that non-TCS items also have to meet these same restrictions. One thing we'll see later is that poultry meat, even though it says no meat or meat byproducts or meat food products, poultry is one that they slipped in as an exemption under one of the USDA rules. They found an exemption, and so you can use poultry meat. So that means you can make a chicken pot pie, but you can't make a beef pot pie or a turkey pot pie, or I guess poultry is turkey, but you can't make pork or beef type products. All right, so time and temperature controlled for safety or not. How do we determine whether the products are TCS or non-TCS? This is an important part of the whole being able to follow the regulations because there are some differences on how you can sell the products and how you need to hold them under temperature control if that's the case. So TCS foods, time and temperature controlled for safety, these require time or temperature controls to limit the growth of pathogenic microorganisms or toxins that can make people sick. So most refrigerated or frozen foods are considered TCS. If you think about the grocery store, those foods around the outer edge of the grocery store, some of the fresh salads or uh, cheeses, milks, dairy products, eggs, a lot of those things are refrigerated, the fresh meats, because they are TCS or frozen. So either you need to keep TCS foods refrigerated or you need to consume them very quickly. So this TCS term really comes from the food code, which applies to restaurants and food service establishments. And so in a food service establishment, if you've got a hot bar or a buffet table, then the TCS foods must be kept hot if they're hot, or they're kept cold. The salads need to be kept cold. The main dishes need to be kept hot. And there's a certain time limit that those can be held before they have to be discarded. And so that may be come into play here as well. So if something is going to be sold hot, then it has to be kept hot. If it's going to be sold refrigerated or cold, then you have to keep it refrigerated. All right. The non-TCS foods, like the jams and jellies and the baked goods, those don't require time and temperature control. Uh, Non-TCS doesn't necessarily mean that it won't spoil, though. So if you think about bread's a non-TCS food. It's basically shelf stable. You put it in just wrapped in plastic. But bread will start to mold eventually. It will go bad, even though it's non-TCS. So the TCS term talks about safety, not necessarily spoilage. Uh, Most shelf-stable products or preserved products that are also considered non-TCS. So if you think about pickles or salsas, canned salsas or hot sauces or tomatoes, things like that that are canned and preserved, either water bath processed or pressure canned, those things are also non-TCS, and because they are considered shelf stable. Okay, so those are the two distinctions. How do we distinguish between TCS and non-TCS in general for most food products? It's really a combination of two properties. And again, this comes from the food code. So pH is one of the properties. This is a measure of how acidic the product is. So most foods are slightly acidic, less than pH 7, but the more acid that's in them, the lower the pH and the more stable they're going to be. So the less chance of pathogen growth or microorganism growth. Water activity is the other one. And water activity really talks about the moisture available for bacteria to grow. So it ranges from 0 to 1. And if you think about pure water, it has a water activity of 1 because it's pure water. If you add salt or sugar to something, it will bind the water so that the bacteria can't use it anymore, and that lowers the water activity. So something like a soy sauce has a lot of salt in it, and the salt lowers the water activity, so no bacteria will really grow in soy sauce. The same things with jams and jellies and preserves, right? We put a lot of sugar. You put a pound of sugar for a pound of fruit, and essentially all that sugar binds the water in that fruit, or you may boil some of the water off, and that lowers the water activity so that the bacteria can't grow. So things that have a water activity below 0.85 is typically considered, regardless of the pH, considered non-potentially hazardous or non-TCS. But you can also think of water activity and relative humidity of being related. So if a food is put in a container and you let it equilibrate with that container, the humidity inside the container, if it comes to 85% humidity, that means that food inside that container had a water activity of 0.85. So the humidity and water activity are also related. But we can measure these two things in a laboratory. pH measurements can be made by anyone. You can buy a fairly cheap pH meter, $50 or something, calibrate it, measure pH very easily. Water activity is a little more difficult. The meters to measure water activity have to measure humidity very quickly, equilibrium humidity around the food, and it costs $5,000 to $10,000 for a water activity meter. So we do provide that measurement service here at the university, and there are other laboratories that can do that as well. Okay, so back to the food code. So based on those two properties, pH or acidity and water activity, we can use a set of tables to decide whether a food is considered non-TCS or needs to have more assessment to be done with it. So if we look at this first table, this is for the interaction of pH. The pH is across the top here, and water activity values are on the first column here. This is for controlling spores, bacterial spores. So a lot of bacteria can produce spores that will survive cooking. And if you let that food sit out at room temperature, then the spores can germinate and grow and generate toxins or something that'll make you sick. So if we heat treat the foods to destroy the vegetative bacteria, those bacteria that are growing, the spores may still be present. So we rely on the water activity and pH to prevent them from being a concern. And these products are all packaged, so also been packaged. So like a jar of pickles, for example. So if we look at the foods that are heat treated and packaged, let's say the pH is between 4.6 and 5.6, and the water activity is between 0.92 and 0.95, then we can use the table to say that that product is non-TCS. All right, so any of the boxes that say non-TCS, that would be in that category. One thing to point out is that the heat treatment should be validated by someone or some reference to make sure that it kills all of the vegetative cells. So 99.999% of the vegetative cells that are in the food, basically all of the bacteria that are in their vegetative state. And then the products may or may not be shelf stable. So you may still have some spoilage that can occur due to spores. The things that are in the pink here are ones that would be by default TCS, unless you have somebody assess those products to determine that no bacteria can grow in them or no pathogens can grow in them. We typically consider these as TCS products in these categories. All right, the second table is the same pH and water activity, but now we're talking about foods that are not heat treated, or they're heat treated but not packaged. So one that would be not heat treated would be mayonnaise. For example, we could have mayonnaise that we just mix oil and vinegar and egg whites together to make mayonnaise, and we don't heat it. The other one is a heat treated but not packaged. An example here would be any kind of baked good or pastry, right? You're going to cook it, but you're not going to put it in a package. So now we have a different set of pH values here at the top and water activities at the bottom, and the same process applies. If we know the pH and we know the water activity range, then we can decide whether it's non-TCS or whether it in the PA categories would be TCS. Okay, so that's a little complicated. We'll give some more examples here in a second. But when we talk about the validation of the heat processing, so typically we want to look for sources that have been published, like the Ball Canning book or the USDA Guide for Canning, or have a process authority evaluate the process and give you a recommendation to use, things to make sure that you're heating it properly. All right, here's a table that gives some examples of non-TCS foods and TCS foods. So if we look at the first row, this is acidified canned foods, things that are pickles, salsas, relishes, barbecue sauces. These have a low pH because we've added acid to them, and they're typically water bath canned. So we would heat them in a water bath to make sure that we kill all the vegetative cells. The opposite would be fresh salsa or fresh salads, fresh pico de gallo, for example, or cut vegetables. These would have a high pH or a high water activity, and neither parameter alone may prevent those pathogens from growing. So they would be considered TCS. If we look at low acid canned foods, things like vegetables or beans in a can, these are pressure canned to make them shelf stable, so they're non-TCS. But if we look at fresh cut vegetables or cooked beans that we've just cooked or cooked rice, those have a high water activity and or a high pH, and the cooking won't kill these spores that we're concerned about. So they may still grow and create toxins. We can look at bottled condiments, fermented foods, dairy products. So hard cheeses and butter would be considered non-TCS, but pasteurized milk, things like fresh cheese and yogurt, those would be considered TCS foods. Beverages, if you're bottling the beverages, then they would be, and heat treating them, then they would be non-TCS. If you're not going to heat treat them, something like fresh squeezed orange juice or fresh apple cider, then those would be considered TCS because you didn't heat process them. A few more examples. We can look at dried products. So anything that's dried, we've reduced the water activity low enough that it's going to be non-TCS. But if we look at the same things like rice or pasta, vegetables that have been cooked but not dried, those are going to, again, be a concern TCS. Jams and jellies, obviously, are non-TCS due to the low water activity or low pH or both. But fresh cut fruits would also be considered TCS. Baked goods, non-TCS if they have a low water activity. Frostings can be either TCS or non-TCS. If the frosting has a low enough water activity, then it can be considered non-TCS. But if you have a higher water activity, then it would be considered TCS. So we would recommend that you test the water activity of the filling to try to make sure it's non-TCS if that's your goal. Candies and chocolates, those are all non-TCS products. But one that we did want to bring up is this we've had an issue with in the past, and that is caramel apples. So apple itself is non-TCS if it's a whole apple. The caramel itself is non-TCS because it's very low water activity. But as soon as you put a stick into the caramel apple, now there's been an issue where bacteria has grown in that injury to the apple where you've stuck in the stick, and people have gotten sick from listeria because of that. So our TDA folks consider caramel apples with a stick in them as TCS. So if you leave out the stick, then it could be considered non-TCS. But I mean, it's a little more difficult to make a caramel apple without a stick. But okay, so just a little bit about safe handling of TCS foods. Here's a summary of what they are: animal-based products, meat and eggs, plant-based products that have been cooked but not, that are fresh and ready to eat. Raw seed sprouts, cut melons, vegetables, leafy greens, those are all TCS. Garlic and oil mixtures are another one that is a concern, and that's because the garlic has a high enough pH to allow botulism to grow in it, and the oil provides the anaerobic conditions for that botulism to occur. So that's a concern and a TCS product. And then most refrigerated or frozen products are also considered TCS. So if it's TCS foods, then we want to make sure we keep those out of the danger zone, this 41 to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Or if it's in that zone while you're selling it or holding it for someone, then typically the food code says it must be discarded within 2 to 4 hours. And so something to consider is if you're going to sell TCS foods at a farmer's market and you're not going to control the temperature, either keep them cold or keep them hot, then is that person willing to sell those? Are they willing to throw away some of that product after a certain time period? Because it can be growing bacteria during those couple of hours. Okay, so general limitations on the Food Freedom Act on homemade products: must be produced at a private residence, can only be sold within the state of Tennessee, and they must meet certain labeling requirements that my colleague Damla will cover here shortly. The non-TCS food items can be sold at multiple locations, either in person or remotely, or even through grocery stores if a grocery store is willing to carry it for you. But the TCS food items must be sold in person, direct to the consumer. So this is a limitation for TCS items. They want to make sure that you sell that directly to the consumer. And we suggest, if they're supposed to be temperature controlled, that you keep them refrigerated during transport and storage while they're being sold. And you make sure you probably should put on the container somewhere that these are TCS items and should be kept refrigerated if that's the case. It's not clear clearly spelled out in the act, but if you're going to sell TCS food items safely, then those are the procedures you should follow. Okay, other changes. The homemade TCS food items can include poultry. So here's this poultry exemption. It turns out that if there's 2 exemptions under the USDA rules that allow someone to sell poultry that has in a restaurant or food establishment. So one is if it's a small poultry producer, you are the small poultry producer, and you have less than 1,000 birds, then you can process that poultry and use it in products without a USDA inspection. The other exemption is one in the regulations under USDA, which allows food service establishments to use already inspected and processed poultry products. So for homemade food manufacturers, this means they could just buy chicken from a grocery store. It's already been processed under inspection, and they can use that chicken to make their chicken pot pies or whatever you want to make with chicken in it. The only reason that they don't allow red meats is because there's no exemption for non-inspected red meats. The USDA has this exemption for poultry, and so they could put that in here and use that exemption, but there is no exemption for red meat. So all red meats that are sold for human consumption must be manufactured under USDA inspection. And so that's still a limitation. That we'll see if it changes in the future, but that's still a limitation. Okay, the last couple things are that the Food Freedom Act, under the Food Freedom Act, you shall not impede the Department of Health in an investigation of a foodborne illness. So that means that the Department of Health may need to come into your home to investigate a potential link between homemade food item and your processing facility. Other things are not necessarily in the rule, but because of FDA rules would apply. So you can't have any health claims on the label. You can't say that this product cures the common cold or whatever ails you, because that would be an FDA regulated product at that point. So, by the way, all of these regulations or exemptions from regulations under the TFFA pretty much violate FDA rules. So the reason that the state of Tennessee can do this is because you're only selling it within the state of Tennessee, and the FDA has basically letting states come up with their own rules for products that are only sold within the state. If these products were sold across state lines, then they would be in direct violation of any FDA rules. So that's why it's restricted to sales within the state of Tennessee. All right. And then one other one that causes a lot of people some concern is that these homemade food items are not allowed to be served or used as ingredients in restaurants, food truck, or catering services. The reason for this is that all of those establishments have to follow the food code, the FDA's food code. And that part of that code says that they must source their ingredients for their food items from a inspected facility. So they can't use uninspected producers for those items. So that's the reason that those are still excluded from the sale of your food items. Okay, I went through that fairly quickly. Hopefully, I gave time for Damla. I will stop sharing here and she'll pop up the rest of it.
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen first.
And then we'll be glad to answer questions at the end.
Yeah, we have some question in the Q&A part, Mark, if you want to go over them, or we can answer those questions at the end of the
Yeah, we'll do them at
presentation.
the end.
Okay.
We're not seeing your presenter mode at the moment.
Yeah. What about now? No?
No.
Liz, do I have permission to share my screen?
Yeah, we see your screen, but it's not the presenter mode. It's the PowerPoint. I see the speaker notes and everything. It's the wrong screen.
The wrong screen. What about now?
There you go. Now you got it.
All right, perfect. So Mark mentioned about the other rules, and I will continue with the labeling requirements for the TFFA regulations. But before that, I want to introduce myself very shortly. I am Damla, an extension assistant professor in food science department at the University of Tennessee. And Mark and I together, we are helping the food entrepreneurs, whether they are under TFFA or they are small food businesses producing their products. We're helping them with their questions, with their testing. And then besides from the testing and the questions, we are also conducting the workshops. The workshops about the Better Process Control School, HACCP, and the preventive control. So if anyone interested in those kind of trainings, then we are glad to provide them those trainings as well. And then that's pretty much what we are doing here. And then I will continue with the labeling requirements for TFFA. So nothing has been changed since 2022. The labeling requirements are still the same for TFFA products. And then the required information are producer information, including producer's name, home address, telephone number. And the other one is the common usual name of the product. And then the third one is the ingredients of the food in descending order based on weight. And then the final one is the statement saying that this product was produced at a private residence that is exempt from state licensing and inspection. This product may contain allergens. So we also have this suggested information on the label for TCS foods, saying that keep refrigerated, just to inform the consumer about the storage conditions. Here we have one example with the pickled beets. We have the common name pickled beets here, and ingredients are listed here, starting from the main ingredients and continue in the descending order based on weight, and then the statements right here. On the back label, we have the contact producer information like producer name, phone number, and the address. The address is going to be the home address because CFFA home items must be produced at the private residence. And we have another example here with sub-ingredients. This is a homemade cookies, and we have the producer name here, the address here, phone number here, and the common name, chocolate chip cookies here. And then ingredients list is here. But what is different in this example is we have some sub-ingredients of the ingredients. The chocolate chips include like multiple sub-ingredients, and all of those sub-ingredients must be labeled, must be on the label. It's on sub-ingredients. The main reason for that is because some of the allergens, like in this example, we have milk and the soy here, can be hidden in the sub-ingredients. So if we don't include this information here on the label, then the customer cannot know what's included in the ingredients, and then they can think that this is safe to eat, even though they have the dairy allergens or the soy allergen. And then lastly, we have this statement here on the bottom that should be on in all labels. And then another labeling example here, this time for the TCS food products. We have chicken salad on the left and we have pimento cheese on the right. We have common name on the top and the suggested information, the suggested statement saying that the keep refrigerated ingredients, including the sub-ingredients of the ingredients, and then producer information, including producer name, address, phone number, and that statement saying that this product is produced at a private residence. Similar thing for the pimento cheese is another example, and it has all the necessary labeling requirements. There are no alternatives for any of the information required on the label. Like this means that if the producer doesn't want to include their home address, then they should go to another road, like they should start producing their products commercially so that they will produce their products at a commercial facility, and then they can write their production address. So basically, if they do not want to have identifying personal information on the label, they need to become a licensed food manufacturer. Then the manufacturing location is going to be included is going to be on the label instead of the home address, their home address. Labeling allergens. People with food allergens need to make an educated decision about the foods they buy. So we talk about this. That is the main reason why the sub-ingredients must be on the ingredient list. And the 9 major allergens in the US are milk, soy, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, eggs, wheat, and sesame. So these are all the 9 major allergens, and they must be on the label. So where does this labeling information go? They must be on a label if packaged or sold in bulk, attached to the product, or attached to the bulk container. They can be on a play card displayed at the point of sale if product is not packaged or sold from a bulk container. This was one of the questions in the Q&A section. So yes, it can be on a play card, especially for the farmers market products. And if they are being sold on the website, this is only allowed for the non-TCA products. And the labeling information must be on the website where the product is sold. If product is sold by telephone or the custom order, the seller must inform the consumer that the product is produced at a private residence that is exempt from state licensing and inspection. Again, this is only for the non-TCS food products. In this slide, we are going to share some recommended good manufacturing practice for homemade food producer. Again, this is not a rule or regulation, but we suggest them, we recommend them to follow the good manufacturing practices for producing this product safe. So these practices include the use of food-grade utensils, equipment, cleaners, sanitizers, packaging materials, and ingredients. Making sure the workspace and equipment is clean and sanitized. And then excluding pets from the workspace. We love them, we love the pets, but we are trying to avoid them to present in the kitchen while we are processing the food. And then closing the bathroom or outer doors while they're preparing the foods for sale. And then, of course, none of us wants to have the pest at our home. So same thing when you produce the TFFA products. So no evidence of the pets are highly suggested. If it's needed, they can use the commercial pest controllers. Okay, and moving forward, we used to have, I mean, we still have the domestic kitchen training on our website, but we are about, replacing replacing that because the regulation has been changed significantly. And then in near future, this domestic kitchen is going to be replaced with the new edition, with the new version. And that is going to um, that's going to include the three parts. And then in first part, the food regulation and safety production of the TFFA products are going to be discussed. And in the second part, the canning, water bed canning and the pressure canning are going to be discussed. And then in last part, starting a home based business are going to be given. With that, we have the last slide that we summarized the TFFA 2025 regulations. So what Mark talked about, he said TFFA requires products to be made at the private residence. He highlighted the word at instead of the in. So that means it could be your backyard, their backyard, or like any place at their private residence. And then TFFA allows both TCA and non-TCA homemade food items in the past. Before 2025, only the non-TCA homemade food items could be produced and sold under TFFA. But now the certain TCA products can be also sold. But like any TCS or non-TCS homemade food products cannot include red meats, fish, shellfish, raw milk, or alcohol as an ingredients or final products. And TCA food items must be sold only in person to consumers. Specifically, labeling requirements are still in effect. Nothing has been changed there. And then no TFFA homemade food items used by restaurants, food trucks, or caterers. None of them can be sold to the restaurant. So that is the summary of the TFFA regulations. Here on this slide, you can see our contact info, the code, the QR code. If you scan this course, then it's going to take you to our website, Facebook page, or LinkedIn page, where we share our publications and the safety tips important to ensure the food safety. With that, I want to thank everyone for being here and listening our presentation. And with that, I think we'll continue with the questions.
Yeah, we can go through the questions. So
Thank you so much. Just sorry to interrupt. I'm gonna set, if you don't mind, set this final survey on the screen while you guys answer questions, just in case
Okay.
Folks need to fill it out and run.
All right. Okay, so I'm looking at the Q&A, and one of the questions says, does the signage, these food products are made at a private residence, etc., need to be placed? Oh, wait, now I'm seeing stuff jump around. What happened? Did somebody answer that question? Where did it go?
That was me. I'm sorry, Mark. It went to the
answered.
It went to the answered. I clicked on it. I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay, so where was it? Yeah, does this need to be placed on the individual item or can it be placed on a card in the group setting? So if the products are packaged the rule clearly states that that statement must be on each individual package. If the products are sold in a bulk container, then and they're scooped out, then you can scoop, then there can have a sign next to the bulk container. But the packaging, if it is packaged, needs to be on the package regardless. Yeah, hopefully that answers that question. If not, feel free to add a follow-up. When it comes to fermented food, how does the pH apply? So most fermented foods by nature have a low pH, and so they're typically going to be non-TCS because of that low pH. But that pH is going to be the important factor in the fermented foods. Do you know if foods that use Worcestershire sauce, which contains anchovy, would be exempt from TCS since it is a bottled product? So yeah, I think that Worcestershire sauce is used in a lot of hot sauces and other things. There's a small amount of anchovies in there. I don't think that's going to be considered TCS or make it TCS. I think and it's allowed under homemade food items, even though it says no seafood in the act. I don't think that this is something that they were trying to restrict, was this small amount of anchovy juice or whatever is in Worcestershire sauce. So I think you're fine with that. It can be used, and it probably wouldn't. It's not necessarily going to make it TCS. All right. Producer of vegetable and retailer of tropical fruits. What authority or license is needed to sell cut fruit cups or veggie cups? So you would need a food manufacturing license from the TFFA, or no, from the TDA.
Farmers market.
Yeah. If you're selling them through a farmer's market,
Yeah.
then there's no license or anything needed. If you're selling them well, let's back up. If you're making them at your private residence and selling them at a farmer's market, there's no license required. If you're manufacturing them commercially, then you would in another facility somewhere else as a business, then you would need to have a manufacturing license from TDA. So this is only homemade food items that are made at your private residence.
And if they want to prepare that in the farmers market, and then they should have the farmers market manufacturing license, right?
The food
Perfect.
unit license.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's another seminar coming up. I think the next one, right, Liz, on what's it called? Something food farmers market food unit.
Right. The farmers
Yeah.
market food unit next week with the Tennessee Department of Health.
Yeah, so remember that this rule, this TFFA, is an exemption in the food manufacturing license. So there's really two categories of foods. There's food service, which is restaurants and food service establishments where you eat something on site, it's prepared on site. That's regulated by the Department of Health. And then there's food manufacturing, where things are made and packaged or made and not packaged, but intended to be sold and taken home and consumed somewhere else, maybe at a later date or later time. So that's food manufacturing. And this TFFA is really part of the food manufacturing rules exemption. So they're really intending these products to be made and sold and consumed elsewhere. If you're going to make something on site and someone's going to consume it there, then it really falls under the category of food service, which is regulated by the Department of Health, not part of this exemption. Even though I will admit that it's unclear the way they've written these rules, because most TCS foods are or most food service items are considered TCS foods. And the term TCS, non-TCS really came from the food code, which is a food service document. So they've really muddied the waters between the two categories. But just remember that this is an exemption in the part of the Tennessee code which deals with food manufacturing, and that homemade food items can be manufactured in your private residence. So that doesn't necessarily, and that gets us to another one where they asked if they could host farm to table dining events at the farm. I don't think you can do that under the TFFA because, again, this is a food manufacturing thing. That's more of a food service uh, activity, which would be under the Department of Health. So the Department of Health would probably have an issue with holding farm to table dining events at a farm without under the TFFA, because it's considered food service. So um, there was a question in here about unwashed eggs, or would unwashed not be allowed? So raw agricultural commodities like eggs, fresh eggs, can be sold outside of the TFFA. That was already allowed. Uh, I think they were supposed to be washed, but I'm not sure that it was specified. It specifies whether you have to wash the eggs. So in fact, we're one of the only countries in the world that requires eggs to be refrigerated during storage and transport. I was just in Australia and saw eggs all over the place on the counter at the grocery stores, unrefrigerated. So I don't think this is part of the TFFA. I think you can sell fresh eggs however you want to sell them, and I don't think anybody's going to complain about they're washed or not washed unless you try to sell them through a retailer. If you try to sell them in a retail establishment, they will remove them from the retail establishment if there's evidence that they were not washed. So a retail establishment must sell eggs that have been previously washed and chilled and put in the proper container and have a date code and all of those things on them. So you could sell them directly at a farmer's market. I don't think that anybody's going to complain about whether they're washed or not. I don't think. All right, there was a question about hard cheeses being non-TCS. And does this mean that ROP aging/storage is allowed? So there's nothing that prevents you from reduced oxygen packaging, aging, or storage. But you just need to be careful about that, knowing that reduced oxygen packaging can cause an environment for botulism to occur. So that's something that you need to consider. If a brewery or distillery or winery wanted to make a product with local produce, nuts, berries, or vegetables, would they not be able to buy the produce directly from a farmer? So, all those items are considered raw agricultural commodities, and they're not necessarily food items or homemade food items. So you can sell raw produce like raw lettuce, raw, just been harvested. You just cut the lettuce and you can sell it, the bunch of lettuce or the head of lettuce, but you can't chop up the lettuce and make a salad and sell it through a grocery store. So under the TFFA, you can chop up the lettuce and sell it as a salad because it's a TCS item. But raw commodities can be used by commercial manufacturers. So berries, nuts, vegetables, they can be used, bought from farmers and producers and used in products. Okay, I'm not sure if that was clear, but these are jumping around. It's hard for me to keep track. What was the rationale behind allowing a home baker to use store-bought USDA inspected poultry? Okay, I'll tell you the story. So it turns out that if the TFFA allowed meat products to be used without inspection or used even inspected, the USDA would complain and they would not inspect any meat produced in the state of Tennessee. They would pull out all of their inspectors. And so the only exemption that exists in the USDA's rules is for poultry. It already exists in their code. And so they could use that exemption to allow poultry to be used as from uninspected sources or purchased from inspected sources. But there was no exemption to allow food service establishments to purchase inspected beef at the moment. USDA doesn't have that in their set of rules. I don't know why they don't have it in their set of rules. that part I can't tell you, but that's why beef couldn't be used in the TFFA because that exemption doesn't exist in USDA rules. All right, so it seems like it would make sense. If you can buy inspected poultry and use it, why can't you buy inspected beef? I think, yeah, I think the reason that you can buy inspected poultry is just due to the poultry lobby uh, pushing USDA to allow that exemption. But it is kind of an odd one. I don't have a really good answer. All right. Is it required to have artisan sourdough bread bagged, or can it be sold unpackaged? I don't know that there's anything that says it has to be bagged or packaged. Uh, I don't know what the pH or water activity of sourdough bread is, but if it's already been baked, then it's just like any other bread. It's probably low enough water activity that it doesn't necessarily have to be packaged. I have the original domestic kitchen. Do I need to update the course? So in regards to the course, so currently no courses are required under the TFFA. I understand that some farmers markets are requiring people to take the domestic kitchen course, and that's fine. The new course won't be anything different in terms of the safety of products and the handling of products. The only difference is going to be the regulatory aspects. So all the things in the domestic kitchen course really talk about the inspection of a home kitchen and the licensing and those kind of things that are required, but those really don't apply under the new regulations. They're just recommendations. So I don't think you would need to take the new course if your farmer's market required you to take the domestic kitchen course and you've already done that. Do you have a list? Do you have to list your name on the label, or can you put the farm name? I believe you can put the farm name as long as they can trace it back to you. It says the producer's name. So if it's produced under your farm's name, I think that's probably fine. I'm not 100% sure on that. But again, I don't think one of the interesting things about this law is that there's no statement about what happens if you violate the law. There's no, usually a law comes out and it says, well, if you violate this speeding, the fine can be up to $500 or $1,000. There's nothing in this law about what happens if you violate it. So I don't know whether or not anyone's going to come after you because you put the farm name instead of your personal name. Uh, Ideally, there needs to be a linkage, and you have to have your phone number. So if you're going to answer that phone, then that makes sense to me. What about tinctures that have alcohol? So anything that has more than 0.5% alcohol is not going to be allowed under the TFFA. That's because the Tennessee's Alcohol and Beverage Commission would regulate those products, tinctures and things that have more alcohol in them. I don't think they would be allowed. Can a local farmer sell duck or chicken eggs be sold to a bakery or restaurant? That's a tough one. I think that farmer produced eggs can be used by a bakery or restaurant. I think they can. I don't know exactly. There's other webinars on selling meat or poultry off a farm. That's something that Liz can address. I've seen baked goods with bacon. It's not allowed. But again, who's checking, who's coming, inspecting these things? No one, because no one has jurisdiction over these products, essentially. So the TDA, Department of Ag, doesn't have much information on their website because these rules exempt you from their rules. This act exempts you from TDA's rules. And you're also not under Department of Health rules because you're manufacturing a food product, although it does mention the Department of Health investigating a foodborne illness. That's the only reference to one of the agencies. So who's looking for the bacon? Nobody. Is it allowed? No, it shouldn't be there. It's not part of the rule. Um, yeah. As a permitted food truck, we were told we could not wholesale any items to local shops with meat unless being inspected. Yeah, that would be correct. How is a baked good different from meat? So it comes down to the the baked goods being non-TCS in general versus meat and the USDA inspection. So USDA governs meat processing, and they're very adamant about having an inspector on site when meat is being processed, packaged, produced, whatever. FDA's rules for other products, everything other than meat, are much different, and the FDA is not present when those products are being manufactured and produced. So it's just the part of our food system where USDA wants to be there, wants to inspect the animals and the carcasses prior to the meat being processed, in order to allow that to be sold and be wholesome. Whereas other products under FDA, FDA gives you more leniency to make those and they inspect them periodically. Does peach cobbler qualify to sell? Yeah, sure. Peach cobblers would probably be considered a non-TCS item because of the pH of the peach and the fact that it's been baked. Have a small store on my farm and sell my eggs. Do I have to wash them? I wish I knew exactly. If you want to sell them through a grocery store, I believe they have to be washed. If you want to just sell them off your farm, I don't think you have to wash them. No one's looking. So the person asked a question about selling fruit or veggie cups. I thought they weren't allowed to sell cut fruit without a permit. That was prior to this new TFFA. So the TFFA, it says you can make TCS foods, and cut fruit and vegetables are TCS foods, and they do not include meat, seafood, unpasteurized milk, so they would be allowed under the the TFFA. Now, whether or not the person's eating them there, whether they're intended to be eaten there, that maybe puts you into the food unit permit thing. Yeah, it depends on the intent of those cut fruit and vegetable cups. That may be where the confusion's coming in. If you're selling them, uh, like you go to the you go to the fair and you buy something to eat right there, that's a food service operation. So that's where a permit is required. Value-added products like hot sauce, salami, jams bought from a farmer's market or from a market direct cannot be served and established under this act. That is correct. That is correct. Nothing made under the TFFA can be sold by a food service establishment in their menu. They can sell them at the front counter pre-packaged. If you package them and wanted to sell them, salami wouldn't be allowed, but unless it's made out of chicken. But jams and hot sauces, if they're jars and bottles of those products, the food service establishment could sell them, but they can't serve them. Yeah. They could sell them for to go. People could buy them from the counter. Oh, is there a criteria that states how long baked goods are expired or eggs? Um, yeah, there is not a set of criteria about how long they're good. So that's just something that something you just people would just have to figure out for themselves. There's nothing that says you have to throw them away at a certain time or you can't sell them past a certain time. Um, I always use the old if eggs float, then they're not good, right? They float, then I wouldn't eat them. I have my manufacturing license. Okay, that's good. But if you use turkey bacon, yeah, turkey bacon is poultry. So I guess turkey bacon would be allowed. Yeah, maybe that's what they're using on these other things with bacon. They just can't use pork bacon. Can you add milk to baked goods? Yep, we always could add milk to baked goods as long as it's pasteurized milk, and it could always be used as an ingredient in baked goods. Um, and as long as it's not raw milk, you can't use unpasteurized milk in anything. So from the roadside stand, yeah. So yeah, I don't know what the not eaten there is, but maybe that's the fruit cup. So foods that made at home and then sold direct to consumer, not through farmers market, would be considered catering and not allowed in our TFA, right? No, um, that's the gray area. So are you this question about foods that made at home and then sold direct to consumer would be considered catering? Not necessarily, because you could make homemade brownies or homemade um, chicken pot pies, and somebody can come buy them from your home. You don't have to sell them through a farmer's market. There's nothing in here about where you can sell them. It just says you have to sell them direct to the consumer if they're TCS. So you would not need a permit to do that. You can do that under the TFFA. Now, whether or not they're going to sit there and eat it or they're going to take it and home and eat it is the gray area. Ideally, this was designed for people to take that product home and consume it. That was the intent under food manufacturing, right? They're going to come buy these products, take them home. It gets fuzzy when you talk about a cooked pot pie that is hot and ready to eat. Are they going to sit in their car and eat it? Or are they going to wait a few hours to take it home? That's sort of like food, like a fast food restaurant, right? This is where this crosses the line between the Department of Health and the Department of Ag. But I think it's allowed. It doesn't say anything about where they consume the products in the act itself. But I think the intent was that they would take them home and eat them. All right. Anything I missed? We follow TCS guidelines. Can we host farm to table? Yeah, I don't think so. Anything else, Liz?
I don't see any. Out of my count, we have got 30 questions asked and answered. So thank you guys so much for that.
We've got, they can easily reach out to us. We can look us up just look up food science at UTK and go to the extension tab and you'll find myself and Damla will be glad to answer any questions.
And I'm sharing our link on our website in the chat.
Perfect.
Oh, that's what you shared. Okay.
And like I said, this session has been recorded, so I'm going to send out to all of the registrants a YouTube link. I mean, it's public, so you can share however you want to. And I will copy you guys on it, so everybody has your information a second time. And I'll
Hopefully nobody from the regulatory side disputes what I've said, answering the question.